Bad things will start to happen. Evil things. They can boast the Antichrist.
The first Omen.
Religious horror is a pretty established subgenre, and I think it can almost be quite stereotypical and very standard. Commentary on religion and faith is always a big and hard topic, but it has led to some brilliant horror films. I found Heretic to be quite a unique take on that, but another film came out last year that I was unaware to the fact that it was a prequel to Richard Donner's The Omen. The film opens with an incredibly ominous meeting between two priests, Father Harris and Father Brennan. We learn that Father Harris is feeling extreme guilt as he's been a part of this conspiracy to bring forth the Antichrist. He hands over the image of a child, intercut with a scene of a volunteer to bear Satan's child. It's really quite unsettling, but despite the fact they state that she's a volunteer and devoted, she has dialogue begging them not to let it touch her again, that she can't do it anymore, really kind of giving the idea that she didn't really know what she was getting into. And they believe that this woman gave birth to the child in the photo, therefore obviously being a child of Satan. The back of the photo has the word Skiana written on it, as well as do leave a like on this video and subscribe if you enjoy. Father Harris leaves the confession consumed with guilt, and Father Brennan chases him out. As Harris turns around to respond to the calls, a stained glass window above them shatters and drops. Slow motion glass falling with a twinkling sound effect, giving the moment an almost magic feeling right next to the horror as a steel pipe falls directly through the back of Harris's head, leaving brain exposed and him for dead. At least I don't think you could survive that, but this is just a hint of the catastrophe that will ensue around anyone involved in this conspiracy. We then cut to Margaret, and it's quite jarring because she looks positive and excited. The change in tone from that opening to then how we see Margaret is just strange and a far cry from each other. Cardinal Lawrence, played by Bill Nye, the religious guy, is taking Margaret to the orphanage where she's going to be working and going to take her vows. He talks about how the church has lost a lot of faith in the public view, and this is set in 1971, and around this time in Rome there were a lot of protests and riots going on, very accurate to the time, particularly against the Catholic Church. And so he's saying how he wants to drive people back towards them, and even though in hindsight, we know what he's specifically referring to. But what I think is interesting is how it's perfectly plausible to believe this could just be said without the conspiracy going on, just about the church as is. We get to the orphanage, and I immediately love how the horror is set up in every scene, putting us firmly in Maggie's shoes, audibly to heighten the scare. Carlita's crayon making the unsettling noise that builds up to her action, and simple stuff that I always love, like having things happening in the background. It causes you to question if what you're looking at is right, it makes you almost want to double take, and I think this film has some expert jump scares throughout the entire runtime. In her meeting with Carlita, we get early hints of the grand scheme that involves them both, and it leads to Carlita licking Maggie's face, and this will become more relevant later on. We get some time with the characters actually seeming relatively normal, and a relationship builds between Margaret and Luz. I think that's how you say her name. Luz is a character that believes in living your life, especially before taking your vows, and devoting your life even more to the church and to God. But this also goes against Maggie's entire upbringing. For us though, it shows Luz in a positive light, and it goes against the natural negative aura of the church that they're at. Eventually, Luz manages to bring Maggie out of her shell, and they end up going out on the sesh. Maggie is pretty reserved throughout most of the night, but eventually she does get comfortable dancing with this guy, Paolo. They dance intimately before she suddenly licks his face, and we smash cut to black. It creates an insanely unsettling feeling, having no idea why Maggie, after being so introverted, suddenly, so confidently did this forward and frankly strange act, as well as making us question why has this now happened twice with Carlita earlier on as well. There's a definite switch in almost who's controlling her, in a way. It's like something takes over. And the fact that we only cut to the next morning after cutting to black forces us to question what happened in between. What does the film not want us to see? But the shot where she does wake up is an absolute standout of the year, probably, and especially of the film. Maggie's uncertain face mixed with confusion as her jet black hair swallows her surroundings, symbolizing how she is in the center of this evil conspiracy, and with hindsight of everything we learn as we go on, it makes this shot even more impressive and smarter. This is Akasha Stevenson's feature directorial debut. She also co-wrote the film, and especially from a directing standpoint, this film is just wonderful. I mean, it feels like it was shot in the 70s, it feels authentic to the time, and just the way they use the camera with slow zooms from a distance and stuff like that, and it just looks beautiful. There are so many meaningful shots, and she absolutely elevates the film massively. Father Brennan finds Margaret sat some distance from the orphanage, and he's spitting these wild claims that Skiana/Carlita lives in the orphanage where she works, saying that there'll be some evil things happening around her, and just asking her to visit him later on at his apartment. One of the next things we see is Maggie seeing a birth of a demon hand from a woman, so traumatic that she faints, and we have to assume it's a hallucination. I think it was, but like, that was still horrifying to look at either way. I think this kind of scene is supposed to represent the fact that the church are bringing in the jackal, which again becomes apparent and relevant later on. Outside, she sees Sister Angelica talking to Carlita, and she takes it upon herself to confront her, as it seemed like those two were having some pretty inappropriate conversations, but this leads to Angelica's sudden and aggressive departure, which then is followed up by seeing her stood on a window ledge, looking down on everyone, dousing herself in gasoline or whatever, waving to all the children and proclaiming, "It's all for you," before setting herself alight and hanging herself. A truly memorable death, and I believe this is pretty much a similar one that happened in the original film. I've not seen it, it's on the list, I'll be watching it at some point this year, I imagine. But I think the fact that two similar deaths happen within like the same continuity almost creates this feeling of a cycle of sorts. But this continues to push the agenda of Carlita being involved somewhat in these plans, as well as making Maggie more likable because she's trying to look out for Carlita. She's formed a bond with her, resonating with her upbringing being very similar. Carlita being sent to the bad room where she's just in complete isolation. That was a form of punishment that Maggie had to endure when she was younger, and something that was very traumatic, and that means more than just a coincidence. After all of that, Maggie decides to visit Brennan, and we learn there are two factions to the church. The one we know, and a hidden section that care much more for their power over society. Religion obviously has an insane influence. I mean, bringing it into today, we saw that the priest in America hit a Nazi salute, and I won't have any arguments. It is that. That is what it symbolizes. That is a terrifying sight for the rest of the world, frankly, and thankfully the church immediately revoked his role. But imagine that didn't happen. And even with that, the power of religion is so far, and the power of faith is so strong, so influential, that almost in this fictional world, that idea of there being a faction dedicated to retaining that control and influence feel more real now more than ever. But I think what the film does well, and a similar way I felt about Heretic, is that it doesn't just say religion or faith is bad. That is a very dangerous path to go down, and frankly, a not morally great one in my opinion. I don't think that's fair, and I'm not a religious person, but I'm not opposed to the idea, and I do believe in something. I don't really know what. I'm kind of figuring it out, and I probably will never figure it out, but you get my point. It makes sure to not just say the church is evil or anything. It is clearly a work of fiction and whatnot, but it also does have real-world connotations to unfortunate events in the real world. So Brennan explains that due to the loss of faith, the hidden faction wished to bring the Antichrist to life in order to give the public something to fear, therefore driving them back to the church, keeping their influence. And he believes the child in the photo is planned to be the mother of the Antichrist, and he believes that it may be Carlita. Also claiming they're mating a jackal as the father. Maggie is understandably doubtful of this, but Brennan very clearly leaves an impression. The film definitely tries to point out Carlita as the one and being the child in the photo, using stereotypes and cliches of this subgenre, being the weird, creepy, quiet girl that everyone seems to dislike. Margaret asks Carlita if anything weird has ever happened or been done to her. We find out that she has visions, nightmares, similar to Maggie, and again, putting us on the idea that Brennan might be right, but also setting up and building more of the connection that we find out exists between Margaret and Carlita. They leave to take all the girls back to the orphanage because there are riots going out, so they're trying to be quick, but amidst the chaos and all the noise, Maggie gets overwhelmed and we see a demon's hand groping her body and then some kind of demonic tongue licking her face, as she is totally hysterical and terrified. Obviously, this reflects back to when she licked Paolo and when Carlita licked her. In the same way, on the cheek, it draws a really suspicious connection. We see her totally lost in a state of fear, implying that she is more central to whatever is going on here as other members of the church just watch her. When they all return, she is told that they don't believe she's ready to take her vows. And so upon this, obviously that being very upsetting, she leaves and runs into Paolo, who is shook with fear the moment that he sees her. Whatever happened that night has clearly left an impression on him as well, and not in a good way. He just begs her to leave him alone. When he does respond, referencing a mark on the back of Maggie's head, he gets hit by a speeding car.
Look for the mark.
And oh my god, another brutal death. Maggie attempts to comfort Paolo, obviously in a lot of pain and fear, but in cutting to a wide shot we see that he was never savable, and that she'd pulled just the top half of his body out, from waist down, was still trapped between the car and the wall. Horrific sight, and understandably sends Maggie running and praying. In another brilliant shot where the candles form the visual of a pair of jaws encapsulating Maggie, symbolising her role again within this entire plot, building suspicion that maybe she could be the child as things are happening around her as well. So we get to the day where Luz takes her vows, and Maggie takes this opportunity to looking into these files that Father Brennan claims they have here at the orphanage. So we get confirmation that the church has been manufacturing childbirths in attempts to birth a mother for the Antichrist. Project Skiana. There are so many files, pretty much all of them leading to the child being deformed at birth and dying immediately. All born at 6 AM on the 6th day of the 6th month. And all of the infants have a 666 birthmark. So she grabs all the files and tries to inform Carlita so she can be taken to safety, as she's the only one that survived. Obviously, the sisters aren't too keen on allowing this, and as they see her trying to get Carlita away, the sisters take Carlita, put Margaret in the bad room. As Carlita is kicking and screaming, Maggie sees a 666 mark on the top of Carlita's mouth. This seemingly kind of confirms that she must be the child in the photo, right? Surely? We get a great scene of a burned Sister Angelica slowly walking towards Maggie in a vision, and it's so suspenseful. It's so slow. It has you waiting for that release as she laughs and gets closer, and Maggie just apologizes profusely. But we never get the release because through comes Father Gabriel, who looked into Maggie's warnings and found all the files, now knowing that there is this conspiracy that he's been unaware of, and he knew Father Brennan before and he didn't listen to him, but now he's listened to Maggie. They get out and knock at Father Brennan's home with all the files, learning that they need a male to actually have the Antichrist come into power, but they've only birthed females. So now they believe that the only way is for the beast to mate with its own offspring. That meaning that the jackal is not only the father, but also the grandfather, disturbingly.
What the fuck?
But Maggie realises Carlita can't be the child in the original photo because it's got a birthmark on the back of its head, and Carlita's is on the roof of the mouth, which means there's two. There are two surviving childs of Satan. So they kept this second child totally hidden to the point Brennan had no idea. Upon inspecting the birthmark and the child's eyes in the photo, she remembers Paolo's final words. She runs her hands through her head, reaching her crown to find a birthmark of 666. Confirmation that she was the child in this photo. She was the child that Father Brennan was bringing warnings of. This triggers all of Maggie's suppressed memories in a really tense, uncomfortable sequence where she remembers the night that we missed with Paolo. He took her to the abbey, and Sister Silver and others of the church bared witness to a ritual assault on Margaret. In mythology, the jackal will pounce only when absolutely necessary. It will aim for survival no matter what, no matter the expense to others. These women who have placed their faith in the church, but have been used to bring the birth of the Antichrist. Maggie obviously descends into turmoil, having all this put upon her without consent, and growing up all her life having no idea. So she declares they need to remove the child now, if she really is pregnant. This very much serves as a pro-abortion message as well, because this woman was unknowingly SA'd and is now being forced to birth this child against her will. Her demeanour changes into a more sinister determination to not allow this child to be born, to not be used in this way, to reclaim her own body. In the car, Maggie begins to vomit and seemingly get possessed just before the car crashes, as I think we hear a kind of double voice. And what follows is a harrowing scene. Maggie wakes up, except it doesn't seem like Maggie is in control now. In an absolutely stellar, insane performance all throughout, but especially this scene, she convulses violently, foaming at the mouth upon falling to her knees. Cloaked figures close in on her as she begins to give birth to the Antichrist. Obviously, this is not a natural birth. We wake back with Maggie on close-ups of her terrified eyes, tied to a bed as members of the church confirm to themselves that she has been the intended mother for the Antichrist this entire time. So before we delve into the last bit of the film, let's recap the entire thing, because it is a bit confusing and it does contradict things that I know about the original, so that kind of made it even more complicated as I was doing research for this. So a hidden part of the church has been trying to birth the Antichrist with experiments using the satanic jackal to impregnate women without their real consent. But the Antichrist has to be a male to come into power. Despite Carlita living, she was too young and Maggie was still alive, so they brought her back to Rome, where that fateful night they summoned the jackal to mate with Margaret, and due to it not being human and not a natural birth, it is all now accelerated and is all happening now at midnight, reaching the 6th of June. It's time for the birth, and the church have now managed to get Margaret back. We up to date? We know where we're going? Because as I say, it does feel a bit messy considering that there are kind of conflicting aspects. They sedate her and proceed to extract the child in a scene that gets more uncomfortable as we go through. She's absolutely powerless and cloaked figures stand by watching on as she begs to stop. But they have now got the child, except it turns out that she birthed twins, one being female, the other being male, meaning they've succeeded. They've achieved their goal of bringing the Antichrist into the world. Maggie asks to hold her child, and we yet have another twist in that Sister Silver is seemingly revealed to be her birth mother. And so I think, I'm not sure if that means she was in the opening assault scene, but it's really horrible either way, because she has no sympathy or guilt for subjecting her own daughter to this absolute torment. Maggie is ready to commit a very late abortion, and she stabs Cardinal Lawrence before trying to escape with the child, but she is then stabbed herself by Luz. Before they leave Margaret and the female child and the jackal to be burned alive in this basement, Carlita was apparently just in a room next to them. Convenient for sure, but then they all get out, obviously without the jackal, that burns, and we get a sequence that ties everything together with the original in a nice little bow. This entire final act is also filled with references to films like Possession and The Shining.
Just give me the baby.
Give me the bat, Wendy.
And they never feel overly derivative. This is a great movie. I didn't catch it at cinemas, I actually watched Immaculate instead, but I think this is the far superior story and execution of very similar ideas. This film is all about motherhood and the responsibility and balance of power. A lot of commentary clearly on abuse, all kinds, but horrifically, especially sexual, with the amount of non-consensual births that have been forced. Also exploring how manipulative faith can be. You can weaponize it. Margaret was brought up in the church and had been manipulated and used her entire life with no knowledge of it. Forced to think certain ways from the day she was born, and I think Sister Angelica is another example of that. She shows quite childlike qualities despite being an adult and a nun at the orphanage. It looks at the power dynamic of the church and draws attention to the sad, dark reality of some real-world religious institutions where there have been exploitations against especially women. And being set in a time where there was serious political unrest in Rome, particularly because the church basically ran Rome. We get what almost feels like a post-credit scene before the credits, where Brennan visits Margaret and her sister Carlita, now raising the female child together. She clearly doesn't want Brennan there, as they want to stay hidden and not be found, but he came just to inform her that they've given the boy to a family, and that they've given him the name
Damien.
the name of the child in the original. The film ends with a haunting score that could be heard throughout the entire runtime that was a beautiful accompaniment to the visuals. Despite not having too much knowledge of this franchise, I'm absolutely keen to delve into the originals now, as well as keeping an eye on Akasha Stevenson's future work. With the knowledge of it being a prequel, I feel it did lessen the originality a little bit, as I later found out there were more references than I initially picked up on, and obviously not really getting it. And as I said, that final bit where Carlita just happens to kind of be nearby and save everyone, such a vital moment in the film being so convenient, is a bit annoying. But overall, I'd absolutely recommend this film.